Hi everyone! Tonight's video is on the light-independent or Calvin cycle reactions of photosynthesis. So the light-independent reactions use the ATP and electrons made in the light-dependent reactions to do something called fixing CO2 into a sugar called G3P. This occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. So let's look at the balanced equation for photosynthesis and see where all of these pieces come from. Carbon dioxide gets into the cell or into a plant cell from the atmosphere via diffusion. Water comes into the plants via osmosis from the roots. And even though this is part of the balanced equation, glucose isn't really what's produced. It's G3P. And then oxygen is a waste product. It leaves the plants by diffusion, and it is the source of oxygen in our atmosphere. So how do water and CO2 enter the plant and oxygen leave? So carbon dioxide diffuses into the leaf via a structure called a stomata. And you can see here, this is a picture just in a light microscope like we have in the classroom. And this structure here that kind of looks like a mouth with lips is called a stomata. And it can open and close and let both CO2 in and oxygen out by diffusion. Water vapor can also leave, and that can be harmful for the plant in a really dry environment. So carbon dioxide diffuses into the leaf when the stomata is open, and it can make its way to the stroma of the chloroplast. Water enters the root of the plant by osmosis. So in order for osmosis to happen, the soil must be hypotonic to the root because we need a concentration gradient in order for water to go into the plant. So how do the light-dependent and light-independent reactions work together? So pictured here is a chloroplast with an exaggerated view of one thylakoid membrane, and this is the stroma. So the thylakoid membrane is indicated here, and the stroma is the space that it is sitting in. The Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions occur in the stroma, and they use the NADPH, which is holding on to electrons that originally came from water, and they use these electrons in this Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle also uses the ATP that was produced by the hydrogen gradient in several reactions in the Calvin cycle. The NADPH is produced in the stroma, the ATP is produced in the stroma, and the Calvin cycle is in the stroma. So there's no transport necessary for the electrons or the ATP. So let's take a closer look at the Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions. I'm going to start with this molecule here. It's called ribulose bisphosphate, and it's abbreviated RUBP. You really only need to know the abbreviated term. It is a 5-carbon organic compound. Ribulose bisphosphate and carbon dioxide come together in a chemical reaction, and the combination of carbon dioxide and RUBP is called carbon fixation. Carbon fixation is the incorporation of carbon dioxide into an organic compound. When carbon dioxide joins RUBP, it has joined an organic carbon and it becomes an organic carbon. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase. You can call it Rubisco. That's a mouthful. This is an extremely important enzyme on Earth. It is responsible for bringing carbon dioxide into an organic compound. So the first product of this carbon fixation reaction is a 6-carbon compound that immediately gets split into 2 3-carbon compounds called PGA. PGA then gets modified by both phosphorylation and added electrons from the light reaction. So both this ATP, which is going to bring a phosphate to the compound, and the electrons being held onto by NADPH came from the light-dependent reactions. This will then regenerate ADP, which will have to go back to the light reactions to pick up another phosphate, and NADP, which will also have to go back to the light reactions to pick up 2 more electrons. Ultimately, what is produced in the Calvin cycle is a 3-carbon compound called G3P. It's an organic compound, and it's a building block for many other organic compounds like glucose and other sugars. Many people often just sort of skip this step and say that glucose is produced by photosynthesis, but that simply isn't true. G3P is the compound that is produced, and then G3P is a building block for other sugars, such as glucose. Now, not all of the G3P that's produced by the Calvin cycle can be immediately taken away and used to build glucose. Some of that G3P is used to regenerate the 5-carbon compound RUBP to come pick up the next carbon dioxide that's going to come into the stroma and run the next round of the Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions. So if we look at a summary of photosynthesis, we have the light reactions where light is going to hit the photosystem in the thylakoid membranes, water is going to come in, and what is released from the light-dependent reactions is oxygen as a waste product, and ATP and electrons being held onto by NADPH. The light-independent or Calvin cycle reactions involve carbon dioxide diffusing in from the atmosphere, and what is produced is a sugar called G3P. ADP and NADP are also formed, which will need to go back to the light reactions to become ATP and pick up electrons to become NADPH. You should be able to fill in a blank diagram such as this. So why do plants have mitochondria? If plants can make ATP from sunlight, why on earth do they need mitochondria? Well, it turns out that all of the ATP from the light reactions is used to make the sugar G3P in the Calvin cycle and regenerate ribulose bisphosphate. There is nothing left over. No ATP leaves the chloroplast. There's nothing left over for building proteins and lipids and nucleic acids, for active transport or moving vesicles along microtubules or exocytosis. And all of these processes, called housekeeping reactions, plants need to do these things and they cost money. They cost ATP. But all of the ATP made by photosynthesis has been used up to make this G3P. So where do plants get the ATP for all of these necessary reactions, given that there's none left over from photosynthesis? Well, let's look at our diagram here. I have my chloroplast here, and it is doing photosynthesis, but no ATP is going to leave that chloroplast. What does leave is some G3P. Some of the G3P has to stay in the photosynthesis range so that it can regenerate the RUBP, but some G3P does leave, and that G3P can be used as a building block for macromolecules such as glycerol that is needed to make lipids. Some of that G3P is then used to build glucose. That glucose can be used for things like cellulose cell walls. Plant cells all have cell walls and they're polymers of glucose. Plants have to make a lot of glucose for those cell walls. So how do we get some ATP to do all the rest of the reactions? Well, any of that glucose that's not used for cell walls gets brought into the mitochondria and it goes through the cellular respiration process to make ATP. So plants have to use sunlight to build glucose, and then they have to use respiration to break it down for ATP in order to do things like build proteins and lipids and nucleic acids and perform active transport and all of these other housekeeping reactions. They have to be done by breaking down the glucose that was made by photosynthesis. So that's why plants need mitochondria, because photosynthesis only makes enough ATP to make the Calvin cycle run. It doesn't make enough ATP to do these housekeeping reactions. So you need to know that RUBP is a 5-carbon compound that first binds CO2. You don't need to know its full name. You should know that rubisco is the enzyme that binds RUBP and CO2 and converts them into an organic sugar. Again, you don't need to know the full name of that enzyme. You should know the definition of carbon fixation. You should know that CO2, ATP, and NADPH go into the Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions, and that those come from the light reactions. You should know that ADP, NADP, and G3P come out of the Calvin cycle. Then ADP and NADP go back to the light reactions to pick up either a phosphate or more electrons. You should know that G3P is used as a building block for sugars, such as glucose. And you should know that this whole process occurs in the stroma. You should also understand the role of the stomata, that structure in the leaf, and what its role is in diffusion in bringing CO2 into the stroma of the chloroplast. and you should understand why plants have mitochondria. So that's all for tonight.